Casting a rigid foam skull using 6-pound density rigid casting foam poured into a 5110 brushed on silicone mold. In this tutorial, we're going to cover a very quick process of casting rigid foam into a silicone mold. And we're casting a skull here. And this, obviously, if you haven't already, be sure to check out the video where we made this skull mold. I will link to this at the end screen of this video, so be sure to check that out. But this is a popular way to create inexpensive prop skulls or skull armatures for sculpting. Now, as mentioned, the 5110 silicone mold obviously was made in a previous video, so be sure to check the links at the end for that video. But overall, that was a very simple silicone mold to make, and we did that as a seamless mold, a brushed-on mold with no seam. And the point of that is so we have minimal cleanup on our cast skull parts. Now, the foam we'll be using is the rigid casting foam, the 6-pound density. We supply this foam in a couple of different densities. The 6-pound is by far the most popular density, but the 6-pound foam expands typically in free rise, expands about 8 to 9 times the original volume. But real important to remember that foams, rigid foams and flexible foams have different expansion rates depending on the geometry of the mold and the working environment that you're in. So warm, humid environments will produce much better, higher expansion rates with foams. Now, we're working with an 8-ounce batch here. I've mixed up 4 ounces of part A and 4 ounces of part B. And an important little trick that I'm doing here is I like to put in the part A first and then add the part B to displace it up to the right line on the graduated mixing cup. Now, the reason for that is the part A is lower viscosity, so it's easier for that to seek a level. If you start with the part B, it's much more difficult to hit those numbers right on the side of a graduated mixing cup. Now we need to mix up our foam parts accurately and thoroughly. Remember, it's not so much how long you mix, but how thoroughly you mix. Make sure you scrape the sides and the bottom of the mixing cup, and you get that stirred up accurately and immediately poured into the mold. Foams like this, expanding foams, have a very short working time, so you want to make sure you get that accurately mixed up and poured into the mold. Typically, a foam like this will have about a 30 to 45 second work time before it starts to expand. So you want to get it out of the mixing cup and into the mold as soon as possible. Now, I apologize for my shaky foam pour here, but I wanted you to see it warts and all from the time I mixed up the foam and poured it into the mold and then sloshed it around. Now, one of the unique properties of this 6-pound density rigid casting foam is it has a longer cream time, and that's that time between when we mix up the components and the time it really starts to foam and foam full blast. So in that time, it's in a fairly liquid state, and we can actually slosh it around and get the detail on the surface of the part really good. And that's important for a part like a skull like this, especially the nose area of the skull. To capture that and get the bubble-free cast, that liquid state, sloshing it around really gets us a nice clean face with no voids. So remember that. There are some foams we have that expand really fast, and this technique is not as practical. Now, the other thing is we did not put mold release inside this mold. And the reason for that is if we use mold release, we then have to clean that off before we paint our cast. Now, my first batch came up a little short, so again, I wanted to show you this whole thing, warts and all. So I mixed up another 2 ounces of rigid casting foam. And I'm doing this with gloves, which is very foolish of me, but remember, these foams are very adhesive, so you do not want to get these on your skin or it'll take forever to wash it off. So make sure you always wear gloves when you're mixing and pouring foam. So all told, this foam cast took about 10 ounces, 8 ounces for the first pour and then 2 ounces to finish it off. And really, you'll see that was probably more than enough. So if it had been warmer weather, that 8 ounces would probably have been more than enough to fill up this mold. So again, real important to remember that the work environment where you are, it plays a big factor in how the foam expands and how much volume you get out of a given foam. So this is winter time here in Texas, but just remember the warmer environments will produce a greater volume than cold environments. And a warm mold produces a much better quality skin with both rigid foams and flexible foams. Now ready to open up our mold. And, I cheaped out on this, just used some electrical tape to close the mold, but we could obviously use a mold strap or some packing tape. I typically use tape on molds like this, and that works great. But you want to be really careful to make sure everything is secured really well on that mold, because that rigid foam, and any expanding foam for that matter, produces a lot of back pressure on the mold. So it can easily pop the mold open if you're not careful. So now we're ready to just roll off that 5110 silicone mold. And now we have our finished foam skull. And again, we had way more volume than we really needed, but I'm going to go back and show you, part of that is kind of by design here, show you how we fix that, because it's inevitable that you're going to have extra foam on a cast like this. So what we're going to do is just use a regular hand saw and cut off that excess foam. Woodworking tools are great for trimming and seaming foam. I posted a video a couple of weeks ago of us casting a life cast with a resin skin of the ArcCast pourable resin backed with this foam, and showed a similar technique for cleaning this up using both a wood rasp as well as a handsaw like this. So great thing to remember anytime you're cleaning up foam casts like this, just use a handsaw to clean that up. Does generate some dust, but very easy to clean up. And then of course you could use Dremel and sandpaper for finer work, but very easy to cut off excess foam. And now we have our finished foam cast. And again, this is a bubble-free, a nice, good quality cast, but if you wanted a better, higher quality skin on this, you could always use our ArcCast pourable resin sloshed around on the inside of the mold. And also important to point out that if we didn't want the foam to come out that kind of bone color, that's the natural color of the rigid casting foam, we could always add some of our Polypig pigments to that foam and change the color according to our needs. So there you have the process of casting a 6-pound density rigid casting foam skull into a 5110 silicone mold. And at the end screen here, I'm going to have links to that previous video about making that 5110 silicone mold, so be sure to check that out. And all of the supplies are of course available at brickintheyard.com. And I'll put all the relevant links in the video description. So if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe, and thanks again for watching.